Life didn't trap you at home by mistake. That stillness you keep trying to escape, the sense that everything out there has moved on without you, that doors are closing while you sit inside a life that's gone quiet. Carl Jung would tell you that isn't a malfunction, it's an instruction. Something in you slowed the world down on purpose, and it did it because there's work waiting for you inside these walls that you'll never do while you're running. Most people, when the outer world goes silent, panic. They read the stillness as failure. They see everyone else's momentum and interpret their own stalled life as proof that they've fallen behind, missed the turn, wasted the years they can't get back. And that interpretation is almost always backwards. Because what looks like being stuck is often the psyche doing the only thing that finally forces a person to turn around and look at the parts of themselves they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Jung spent decades watching people arrive at his door during exactly this kind of period. Not in the middle of exciting expansion, in the middle of a strange, unwanted pause. Their careers had flatlined, their relationships had gone still. The forward motion that used to define them had simply stopped, and they couldn't figure out why. They came to him wanting help getting moving again, wanting the momentum back. And Jung, more often than not, would quietly recognize that the stopping was the whole point. He understood something that runs against everything we're taught. There are times in a life when the psyche deliberately withdraws its energy from the outer world and pulls it inward. When it does this, everything external starts to feel flat and effortful, and everything you try to build out there refuses to take hold. It isn't punishment, it's a redirection. The energy you'd normally spend chasing, achieving, and performing is being called home to do a different kind of work entirely, the kind that only happens when the noise stops. Today, I want to walk you through what Jung discovered about these homebound seasons, why life keeps certain people still when they most want to move, what's actually being built inside you during the pause, the signs that you're in this process rather than simply failing at life, and why the work happening in the quiet is the most important work you will ever do, even though you can't see it while it's happening. Think of the psyche as a house. Most of us live in 3 or 4 rooms and never venture into the rest. There's the room where we perform for the world, the room where we do our work, the room where we manage our relationships, maybe a small room where we allow ourselves to feel a little. And we move between these familiar rooms so automatically that we forget the house is enormous. There are floors we've never climbed to. There are doors we walked past so many times we stopped seeing them. There are entire wings sealed off, full of things we decided long ago we didn't want to look at. When life is going well externally, when the world is rewarding your movement, you never explore the rest of the house. Why would you? You're out, you're busy. The doors stay closed, and you tell yourself the closed rooms are storage, nothing important, nothing you need. You build an entire identity out of the few rooms you're comfortable in, and you call that the whole house. You call it who you are. And then, something changes. The outer world stops opening for you. The opportunities dry up, the momentum dies. The version of you that used to thrive outside suddenly can't get traction. And you're forced back inside, back into the house. And at first this feels like defeat, because you built your whole sense of self on being out there, in motion, producing. Being stuck at home in yourself feels like being buried alive. But Jung recognized what actually happens when a person is confined to the house of their own psyche, with nowhere left to run. Slowly, out of boredom, out of restlessness, out of the sheer inability to keep distracting themselves, they start to notice the doors, the ones they walked past for years. And eventually, not because they want to, but because there's nothing else to do, they start to open them. This is the hidden work. This is what life is keeping you home to do. Not to punish you with stillness, but to force you into the rooms of yourself you've spent decades avoiding. Because those rooms contain everything you need to become whole, and you were never going to enter them voluntarily. Jung called the contents of those sealed rooms the shadow. All the parts of yourself you decided were unacceptable and locked away. The anger you weren't allowed to feel. The needs you learned to be ashamed of. The ambition you buried because someone taught you it was arrogant. Or the softness you buried because someone taught you it was weak. The grief you never finished. The versions of yourself you abandoned to become the version the world would accept. All of it, sealed behind doors, waiting in the dark. And here's what he understood that almost no one talks about. You cannot integrate what you refuse to look at, and you will not look at it while your life is full of movement and noise. The shadow only becomes visible in stillness. It only surfaces when the distractions run out, which is exactly why the psyche will sometimes engineer a period of enforced quiet, a homebound season, to give the shadow a chance to finally come up into the light where you can meet it. Picture someone who spent 20 years building a career, filling every hour, always with the next thing lined up. They were never home, not really, not in their own life, not in themselves. There was always somewhere to be, something to achieve, a reason to stay in motion. And motion, for them, wasn't just ambition, it was avoidance. As long as they kept moving, they never had to sit in a quiet room with the parts of themselves they'd been running from since childhood. Then the movement stops. The job ends, or the body gives out, or the world simply stops offering the next rung. And this person, who has spent their entire life outrunning something, suddenly has nowhere to run. They're home, in the house, in the silence, and the first thing that happens is terror, because the silence is full of everything they built the movement to avoid. Jung would look at that terror and recognize it as the beginning, not the end, because that person is finally standing in front of the doors, and the whole rest of their life depends on whether they can find the courage to open them instead of frantically trying to restart the movement. Let me describe what this homebound season actually feels like from the inside, because it's more specific than most people realize, and recognizing it can change everything about how you relate to it. The first thing you'll notice is a strange loss of interest in things that used to drive you. The goals that once excited you feel hollow. The ambitions that structured your days lose their pull. You keep trying to want what you used to want, and the wanting won't come. This isn't depression in the way people usually mean it. It's the psyche withdrawing its investment from the outer world so it can redirect that energy somewhere you can't yet see. The second thing is a kind of enforced slowness that you didn't choose and can't seem to break out of. Your plans keep falling through. Your efforts to get moving again keep meeting resistance, as if the world itself has quietly conspired to keep you where you are. You push, and nothing gives. And every failed attempt to escape the stillness feels like more evidence that you're failing at life, when it's actually the process holding you in place long enough for the real work to happen. The third thing, and this is the one people most often misread, is the sudden surfacing of old memories, old feelings, old versions of yourself you thought were long buried. You find yourself thinking about things from decades ago. Emotions rise up that don't connect to anything in your present. Old wounds start aching again, as if they'd only been sleeping. This is the shadow coming up. The sealed rooms are opening on their own, releasing what they held, because the stillness has finally given them room to breathe. And the fourth thing is a deep, sometimes overwhelming pull towards solitude that the people around you don't understand. You cancel plans. You avoid gatherings. Interactions that used to feel easy now cost you something you can't afford to spend. Your family worries. Your friends think you've changed, withdrawn, become difficult. What they can't see is that you're doing interior work that requires almost all your available energy, and you simply don't have the surplus to keep performing the social self you used to perform so effortlessly. If several of these are true for you right now, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not falling behind. You're not broken, and you haven't wasted your life. You're in the house. The doors are opening, and the work that's beginning is the work that most people never get to do, because most people manage to keep running until the very end. Now, here's where Jung's understanding becomes genuinely radical, and where it separates from every self-help version of everything happens for a reason. He never claimed the process was gentle. He never promised the rooms would be pleasant to enter. When you finally open the sealed doors, what comes out is not always beautiful. Sometimes it's rage you didn't know you were carrying. Sometimes it's a grief so old you'd forgotten its shape. Sometimes it's the recognition that the life you built was constructed to please people who never really saw you. And that recognition is devastating because it means examining choices you can't take back. This is why so many people, given a homebound season, do everything in their power to end it prematurely. They feel the doors starting to open, feel what's behind them beginning to stir, and they panic. So, they throw themselves back into motion. They take the first available job even though it's wrong. They start a new relationship before they've understood why the last one ended. They fill the silence with anything that will make it stop. New projects, new distractions, new noise. And they succeed, sort of. They get moving again. From the outside, it looks like recovery, like they weathered the storm. But the doors close again. The rooms seal back up with everything still inside them, unmet, unintegrated, waiting. And that person carries the sealed rooms forward into the rest of their life, sensing them without ever entering them, living in 3 rooms of a mansion and calling it home. Jung watched this happen constantly, and it grieved him, because he could see the transformation that was trying to occur and the person's inability to tolerate the discomfort long enough to let it complete. Because the work is uncomfortable. That's the part nobody prepares you for. Opening the door on your own suppressed anger and actually feeling it, without acting on it and without pushing it back down, that's hard. Sitting with the grief you've been outrunning for 30 years, that's hard. Facing the parts of yourself you decided long ago were unlovable, and choosing, finally, to bring them back into the house instead of leaving them locked in the dark. That's some of the hardest work a human being can do. And you can only do it when life keeps you still enough to stay in the room. If you've been feeling this, the stillness that won't lift, the doors that seem to be opening whether you want them to or not, the sense that something inside you is asking to be met, you might find real help in the reflection exercises we put together in our guide, True Self-Discovery. 24 practices built directly on Jung's approach to the inner work, designed for exactly this kind of homebound season, to help you walk through the rooms you've been avoiding instead of running back out the front door. It's the difference between enduring the stillness and actually using it. The link is right below. But stay with me, because there's something crucial about this process that changes how the whole thing works. The hardest part of the homebound season isn't the discomfort of what you find in the rooms. It's the gap. The long, disorienting stretch between the moment you start opening the doors and the moment anything new begins to take shape. Because once you've entered the sealed rooms, once you've begun dismantling the small, safe version of yourself you used to live in, you don't immediately have a new self to replace it with. You're in between. The old identity is dissolving and the new one hasn't formed. And that in-between place is the loneliest, most frightening ground a person can stand on. Jung understood this gap better than almost anyone, and he was honest about how brutal it is. The ego, the part of you that needs to know who you are, needs a role, needs a plan, goes into a kind of primal panic when it loses its structure. Everything it used to orient by is gone. You don't know who you are anymore. You don't know what you want. You don't know where any of this is going. And every instinct screams at you to end the uncertainty, to grab the first available identity, the first available direction, anything that will make the free fall stop. This is the moment when the whole transformation hangs in the balance. Because the gap is not empty, even though it feels like the emptiest place you've ever been. The gap is where the new self gestates. It's the pause between the exhale and the inhale. That moment of complete stillness after you've breathed all the way out before the next breath begins. That stillness feels like nothing is happening, but without it, the next breath can't come. Try to skip it, try to gasp for air before the pause completes, and you don't breathe better, you hyperventilate. Frantic, shallow, no real sustenance. The people who emerge transformed from a homebound season are the ones who can tolerate the gap, who can sit in the not knowing without immediately filling it, who can bear the terrible question, who am I if I'm not the person I spent my whole life being, without rushing to answer it with the first thing that comes along. This tolerance is one of the most demanding things a human being can do. Every cell in your body wants resolution. Your mind races to construct plans, to project a future, to give you back the sense of solid ground. And the work is to hold all of that, to let yourself be nobody for a while, when you've spent a lifetime needing to be somebody. Jung described a phenomenon he called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to produce something genuinely new when you can hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into one side. When you can feel completely lost and somehow still trust the process. When you can grieve what's dissolving and stay open to what's being born. When you can sit in the gap, in the fire of not knowing, long enough for something to emerge that neither your conscious mind nor your unconscious could have created alone. But it only works if you stay. The moment you flee back into the old identity or leap prematurely into a new one, the function shuts down and the transformation aborts. What emerges, when you can stay long enough, is always larger than what came before. This was consistent across everything Jung observed over decades. The new self that forms in the gap carries a quality the old self never had, a groundedness that doesn't depend on external circumstances, a sense of being rooted in something deeper than your roles and your achievements. Because the old self was built from accommodation, from what your parents needed, what your culture expected, what would earn you approval and safety. The new self is built from an actual encounter with who you are underneath all of that. And you can only meet that person in the house, in the stillness, with the doors open. Let me tell you what this looks like when it goes right, because the abstract can only carry you so far. Consider someone who spent their whole adult life being the reliable one, the one who held everything together, who was always available, who measured their worth entirely by how useful they were to other people. They never stopped moving, because stopping would have meant feeling how empty they were underneath all that usefulness. As long as they were needed, they didn't have to face the possibility that they had no idea who they were when no one needed them. And then life kept them home. The circumstances varied, maybe an illness, maybe a loss, maybe just the slow erosion of all the roles that used to keep them busy. And suddenly, they were alone in the house, with nothing to do and no one to be useful to. The panic was enormous. The urge to find someone new to serve, some new way to be needed, was almost unbearable. But circumstances kept them still. The doors wouldn't stay closed anymore. What they found behind those doors, at first, was rage. Decades of resentment they'd never allowed themselves to feel, because feeling it would have contradicted the selfless image they'd built. And beneath the rage, an old, buried grief. And beneath the grief, something they hadn't touched since they were very young, their own wants. Desires that had nothing to do with being useful to anyone. A self that existed for its own sake, that they'd sealed away so long ago they'd forgotten it was there. They sat in that house for a long time, longer than felt bearable. And slowly, in the gap between who they'd been and who they were becoming, something reorganized. They didn't emerge as a shinier version of the reliable one. They emerged as someone who could give without disappearing, who could be present without being consumed, who finally knew the difference between love and the compulsion to be needed. And that difference changed every relationship they had from that point forward. Jung noticed something about people who completed this kind of crossing that used to drive his more rational colleagues to distraction, because it sounded almost mystical. He called it enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite at the point of their greatest intensity. The period of deepest isolation often gave way to the most genuine connections of a person's life. The season of most complete meaninglessness often birthed a sense of purpose more real than anything they'd known. The time when they felt most stuck, most kept in place, most homebound, turned out to be the precise moment their life was finally reorienting towards something true. He wasn't being mystical, he was describing a mechanism. When the ego's agenda finally exhausts itself, when all the plans and the forcing and the running out of momentum finally stop, the deeper intelligence of the psyche gets a chance to speak. And that deeper intelligence has been watching the whole time. It knows things about you that your busy, performing mind never had the quiet to hear. It knows what actually fulfills you, who you really are, what kind of life would feel like breathing after decades of holding your breath. It just could never get a word in while you were out there in constant motion. The house had to go quiet before you could hear it. And this is why life keeps certain people home. Not to end their story, but to finally give the deeper self a chance to be heard. The stillness isn't the absence of your life. It's the condition your life required to become real. There's one more thing Jung understood about this that I think matters enormously if you're in the middle of it right now. He observed that the psyche never initiates this kind of dismantling in someone who can't survive it. The demolition doesn't happen at random. It happens when something in you has gathered enough strength to rebuild from the foundation. So the very fact that you're in this, that life has kept you home, that the doors are opening, that everything familiar is dissolving, is itself evidence that you have the capacity to make the crossing. The unconscious doesn't tear down structures it isn't ready to rebuild. Sit with that for a moment. The thing that feels like proof you're falling apart is actually proof that something in you is strong enough to be rebuilt. You wouldn't be in the house if you couldn't do the work the house requires. The transformation chooses people who are ready, and it almost always chooses them at the exact moment they feel least ready. That's not a contradiction. That's how it works. The not feeling ready is part of the readiness. If you're standing in that house right now, in the stillness, with the doors starting to open and no idea what comes next, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for precisely this ground. The 24 reflection exercises are shaped around Jung's framework for the interior work, a way to actually enter the rooms you've been avoiding and hear what the deeper self has been trying to tell you all along. So you're participating in your own transformation instead of just white-knuckling through the silence. You'll find the link waiting for you below. So what does the other side of this actually look like? What emerges when a person stays in the house long enough to finish the work? Jung's answer surprised even the people closest to his thinking, because he didn't describe it in terms of external results. He didn't talk about the new career or the better relationship or the restored momentum, though those often followed. He described an internal shift so fundamental that it changed the person's entire relationship with being alive. They developed what he called a relationship with the self, a felt sense of being anchored in something deeper than their circumstances, something that couldn't be taken from them by loss or failure or the opinions of other people. They moved through the world differently after that. They made decisions from a place of inner alignment rather than external pressure. They could tolerate uncertainty because they'd already survived the deepest uncertainty there is, not knowing who they were and living through it anyway. And they could be alone without being lonely, because they'd discovered that the companionship they used to seek out there was available inside the house all along, in rooms they'd finally learned to enter. They also developed a strange kind of peace with their own complexity. They stopped needing everything to be simple, good or bad, success or failure. They could hold contradictions without rushing to resolve them. They could see the shadow in bright things and the value in difficult ones. And most of all, they stopped living in the future, always reaching for the next thing that would finally make life feel complete, and stopped living in the past, endlessly reviewing their choices for evidence of failure. They became present in a way they'd never been, because the house had taught them that the only place life actually happens is right here, in the room you're standing in now. This is what life is keeping you home to build. Not a better version of the person you were running as, but an entirely different relationship with existence. One where you're finally living in the whole house instead of hiding in a few rooms, where the parts of yourself you sealed away have been welcomed back, where you're no longer at war with your own depths. And there is no way to that except through the stillness. Jung looked for a shortcut his entire career and never found one. The homebound season is the path. The being kept still is the work. So if you're there right now, if the world has gone quiet around you, if your momentum has died and your plans keep dissolving and you can't understand why life won't let you move, I want you to consider that nothing is actually wrong. Something in you slowed everything down because there are rooms in the house of yourself that have waited your whole life to be opened, and you were never going to open them while you were out there running. The stillness you're fighting is the stillness the work requires. And the work is the most important thing you'll ever do, even though, especially though, you can't see it while it's happening. Your only task right now is to stay, to resist the pull to force the movement back before it's time, to let yourself be still in the house, with the doors opening, tolerating the not knowing one more day and then one more after that. To trust that the emptiness isn't the absence of your life, but the space your life needs to become real. The energy that used to pour out into the world is being called home, and what it's building in the quiet, in rooms you haven't fully entered yet, will be more genuinely yours than anything you ever built while you were running. The best of you is being assembled in the stillness you keep trying to escape. Stay home a little longer, open one more door, and pay close attention to the silence, because everything the deeper part of you has been waiting decades to say is finally, in the quiet of the house, becoming something you can hear. If you haven't yet, take a look at our guide, True Self-Discovery. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, made for exactly the kind of stillness you might be standing in right now. A way to enter the rooms you've been avoiding and start listening to what the deeper self has been waiting to tell you, instead of running back out into the noise. The link is right below.